We all have these invisible barriers around us that dictate how we handle life, how we show up, how people speak to us, how people treat us, how we speak and treat others, physical boundaries like touch. We often have partners that display behaviors, and we get so scared to say something because they could break up with us, it could start a big blow-up fight, the list of reasons goes on. And I have learned to say it anyways, because if you don't, especially in intimate relationships, that resentment builds.
Justin McNeal, Executive Director at Begin Anew, teaches us a crucial yet often overlooked concept: boundaries. He not only shows us how to establish boundaries with others, but also emphasizes the importance of setting them within ourselves. His insights serve as valuable guidance for both our professional and personal lives.
I think a lot of people fear setting a boundary because they don't want to come across as sensitive.
Yes.
I think that's a big thing of why, I personally don't want to set a boundary because I'm like, well, they're going to think I'm sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say about that?
I think we live in a world where we get very concerned about what people think and feel about us, that sometimes we need to realize, I think what's more important is our peace of mind. No is a full answer, right? It's not a partial answer. It's not part of the thing. It's no can be a full answer when it comes to setting a boundary.
Welcome to Motivation Monday. We're here with the wonderful Justin McNeal, Executive Director at Begin Anew nonprofit. How are you, Justin?
I am doing great, and thank you for having me today.
Yes, I am so excited to talk to you about something because this is something that many people don't really want to talk about. Boundaries. What are they?
Yeah, boundaries, it's a very hard thing, and it's a very hard thing for a lot of people to talk about, to recognize, to want to address in their life. And just like when we were on the show a little bit earlier today, when I was talking about boundaries, is a really good way to describe it is we all have these invisible barriers around us that dictate how we handle life, how we show up, how people speak to us, how people treat us, how we speak and treat others, physical boundaries like touch. A good example is I have no physical boundaries like that. Someone can just come up and hug me, and I'm fine with that. Versus my sister, if you try to hug her, she's going to run away from you as fast as she possibly can. And so you have those boundaries, and we have emotional boundaries, spiritual boundaries. And so you can see almost every area of life that you can touch on, there are these things that we call boundaries that kind of dictate how we feel and what makes us comfortable to be in these spaces.
Why do you think people have different boundaries? We as individuals, like your boundaries could be different from mine.
Yes, that's very good. I think that it comes down to life experience and the way that people have treated us in the past, and that just everyone's really unique. What our likes and interests are can be different, and that can really dictate boundaries too. Because I know a lot of people, they have boundaries, like a boundary in their social life is they'll go out all the time with their friends and do stuff. Versus I was just talking with someone today, I'm a little more introverted where my boundaries are I may go do one thing a week and the rest of it I'm at home.
Really?
And it's just how we are as people, right? Some people are introverted, some are extroverted, and a lot of those things tie into it.
I promised you, Justin, that I would be vulnerable today and share with you some of my boundaries. So, for example, and I'm sure people could relate, one thing about me is if I set a boundary, I don't really know how to set a boundary. Let's start there.
Yeah, right? That's a good place to start.
Yeah, let's start there. I don't know how to set a boundary. But even if I do, I feel bad. I'm like, oh my gosh, what is this person going to think of me? I don't want them to get the wrong idea. I don't like that about myself because I want to be that type of person that, sets a boundary and that's that. You know what I mean? So what is your advice to somebody that feels bad about setting a boundary?
Well, I always say, especially if it makes you nervous, setting boundaries is going to be hard no matter what you do. And so in the beginning, it takes practice. And it's something as silly as doing a mock interview in the mirror, saying like practicing over and over what you're going to say to a person is a good way to learn to get it out. And it can be so hard in the beginning to do that, and it can make us uncomfortable. And the one thing that I have learned about boundaries is if you set a boundary with a person and they get upset and they don't want your services anymore, if we're talking like a work relationship, or they don't want to be a friend, they don't want to be your partner, they might have not been that good of a person to begin with. Because all a boundary is doing is saying, hey, you're displaying some sort of behavior, you're doing some sort of action, and I'm not okay with that. And so some tips I also give people is never apologize for setting a boundary. So don't start off with saying, I'm sorry, I need to say this. Or if someone makes a comment about my looks and I don't like that, It can vary. That happen to women a lot. It can happen a lot in relationships where you're mentoring people or working alongside people. I never say thank you before I set a boundary.
Hmm.
Like if someone made a comment about looks, I shouldn't say thank you. Don't talk to me like that because that's conflicting. And I think a big part of it is the practice and then just getting it out there. And then once you do it 1 or 2 times, you realize it's not nearly as scary as it seems.
I'm going to paint you a picture, Justin, because this came to mind, and I think this is important to talk about. Let's say we're in a work environment and somebody goes, ew, your makeup's ugly. And you're like, I know they said it as a joke and I know they didn't mean it that way, but I'm scared if I say something to make the rest of the work environment uncomfortable. And I feel like that's the thing that stops a lot of people from saying something is making others uncomfortable.
Right?
How do you work around that?
I think what I have learned is this is not the greatest answer is you just have to do it anyways.
Oh, no, that's not the answer I was hoping for.
Yeah, and it can be hard because sometimes I'll let it slide once or twice if I thought maybe they're just having an off day, maybe they didn't realize they said something. But if someone has a behavior, let's say they say something like that to you, and you don't address it, that opens the door for more of it to happen. And how does someone know that they've done something to upset you or make a comment that you don't like without you telling them? And if you don't tell them and you allow it to continue, it often comes up in a blow up. So, instead of setting a boundary in a healthy way, saying, hey, when you just made that comment about my makeup, I'd appreciate if you didn't make comments about my looks like that. If you just let that continue and it happened 4 or 5 times, you might yell at them the time when it comes to set a boundary because you're so emotional. Your emotions raise up.
Huh.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people fear setting a boundary because they don't want to come across as sensitive.
Yes.
I think that's a big thing of why, I personally don't want to set a boundary because I'm like, well, they're going to think I'm sensitive. What do you say about that?
I think that feelings are valid and they matter. And if something upsets you, it's important to talk about it, regardless of how you get viewed. I think we live in a world where we get very concerned about what people think and feel about us, that sometimes we need to realize, I think what's more important is our peace of mind, right? And if someone is doing something that I don't agree with, I better say something or how are they ever going to know?
All right, so let's learn. How do we set a boundary? Can you give us a few examples and then how to set that boundary?
Yeah, so with me, it was a big reason why I learned to set good boundaries is because I used to have terrible boundaries and people would have to set them with me. And so a good example that we practice a lot in work is, especially in workspaces, the nice thing about work is you can often go back to company policy. So if someone says or does something that upsets you, you go, well, my company policy says I'm not allowed to do this or do that. And so when you're
Blame it on the work.
Right, yeah, and so you can blame it on the work in the beginning until you get comfortable with it. But a big one that we come across with in the recovery space, addiction recovery spaces, we work one-on-one with people, and oftentimes people will say, hey, that's a really nice sweater, or did you get a haircut? Funny with me being bald, right? Did you get a haircut? You look really good in that. You look cute. You look handsome. It's just a little remark they say, and I immediately address it by saying, hey, I noticed you made a comment about my looks. I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't continue to make comments. This is a professional relationship, and I want to focus on your life and your recovery, not what I look like today. And there's ways. So if you heard that, it doesn't sound that bad. It's not that scary. And if you are good and you practice some of these go-to phrases when people cross boundaries that you can just fire off at the top of your head, it doesn't come off as disrespectful. I very rarely, when I set boundaries, have people get upset and leave. Like I said, if they do get upset and leave, that's on them. It has nothing to do with you.
I'm just focused on the uncomfort of it all. That's something
That's
that keeps
what it is.
scaring me. Is like if you had said that to me, I'd be like, oh my gosh, did I say that? Did I make him feel this way? And it'd be uncomfortable. So how do you deal with the uncomfort of it all?
I think that you just have to. Because, a good example of this is when I first got into the workspace and was learning about boundaries, I'll be vulnerable too. I made some comments in the workspace to the opposite sex of me, and it wasn't anything super inappropriate. It was something, just like I said, about someone's looks, how their hair looked or something like that. And then they went to my boss and told them how much that upset them. And then my boss, who was a female, had to have a sit-down conversation with a guy and say, that this is not how you show up in the workplace. You don't make comments like that. Be very smart about how you talk. And I could imagine that was very uncomfortable for her, having to talk to a male staff about crossing boundaries with another female staff and her being female. And I mean, I was embarrassing for me too, and I just had to learn to deal with it.
Do you feel like that was a blessing in disguise for you?
It was because it completely changed how I showed up at work.
Mm.
Like I said, it wasn't anything super inappropriate or something that you would lose a job over, but it made me realize that you can, just like you said, that comment about the makeup, that person may have never realized that that was something they shouldn't be saying or that it could upset someone until someone does it. And I think that's the mindset of when you get scared to say it is, if I never say it, how are they ever going to know? And that's even with intimate relationships, boyfriends, girlfriends, whoever. We often have partners that display behaviors, and we get so scared to say something because they could break up with us. It could start a big blow up fight. The list of reasons goes on. And I have learned to say it anyways, because if you don't, especially in intimate relationships, that resentment builds.
Hmm. Can we talk about a time in your life when you didn't set boundaries and or weren't good at setting boundaries?
Yeah, I have one of the worst boundaries I had when I first got into the substance use disorder workforce was saying yes to everything. I wanted to be the best. I wanted people to know who I was, and I wanted to look at it as a hard worker. And so I would just take on project after project, and I would never say no, filling up my entire day and evening with all this stuff. And it got to the point where I started to crash and burn, where I get so stressed out, you can't show up to work. You have such a high workload that you can't handle anything, and your just anxiety goes through the roof. And so that's even a boundary. You have to learn to say no. You have to learn to address people and say that I've had enough. And we teach this in our boundaries training that no is a full answer, right?
Hmm.
It's not a partial answer. It's not part of the thing. It's no can be a full answer when it comes to setting a boundary.
Nice. Do you think people, when they have difficulty setting boundaries, there's a sense of people pleasing in there?
Yes. And so a good example too, like I shared about my first experience when I first got into the workforce. Setting boundaries was so hard for me because I'm a person in recovery from addiction. And a lot of people, when they go through struggles, and it doesn't need to necessarily just be addiction or mental health, it could be toxic relationships, the list goes on. We become people pleasers. We don't want people to be upset. And we don't know how, like you were sharing a little bit, how to set boundaries because we've never done it. And oftentimes we've crossed people's boundaries to take advantage of them one way or another. It's just a big thing in the addiction world. You kind of use people when you get wrapped up in your addiction enough, and you start to learn that that's okay, even though it's not.
Mhm.
And so a big part of it is unlearning behaviors you've learned, and that realizing you cannot please everybody, or that you should be wiser about how you please people.
How have you seen your life transform when you started, setting boundaries?
I think I started to show up healthier in intimate relationships and friendships. People started to take me a little seriously at work. So when I wasn't just joking all the time and when I was taking things seriously, um, it started to affect better areas of my life. And then what's funny is if you can focus, let's say you're not good in personal boundaries in your personal life, but in your work area, you're really good at it. I started setting a lot more boundaries at first at work, and then it started to spill into my personal life. I started
Hmm.
realizing, oh, I'm not setting boundaries here, here, and here in my personal life. And if I can do it in my work life, I could certainly try to do it in my personal life. I
Hmm.
often feel sometimes personal is a lot scarier because you can sometimes leave work at work. In your personal life, it's always there, and it can be harder with the ones we love because they may react different than a coworker would.
Hmm.
They may talk to us different. They may be a little bit more of a truth teller or lose their cool,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
If you're open to sharing, what are some boundaries that you have set that are like, hey, you can't cross these?
So I think certain boundaries, especially in my personal life, is when people talk to you in a disrespectful way.
Hmm.
Um, Another boundary I have when it's not with people, just personally with me, it's like I go to bed by 10 o'clock every night so I can get up at 6 o'clock every morning. I mean,
It's a
depending
boundary
on
I
a different
need.
day. Right. Yeah. And it's bad. It's just little ones like that. And that I'm very careful about friends I allow in my life. Depending on how you're living your life and the way you live it and the way you show up is going to dictate if I allow you in my life or not, because I don't want drama. I don't need people bringing unnecessary nonsense into my life. And when I set a boundary around, I'm only going to invest in people that invest in me,
Hmm.
that are willing to put in as much as I'm willing to put in. So that's all the people in my contact list, so my friends group is I know I could call them at any time and that they could call me at any time. And that's because of boundaries I've set, because I've only put key people in my life and allow no nonsense, sort of.
So, okay, let's say a friend comes into your life, Justin. Do you go, these are my boundaries, boom, 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 boom? Or is this over time?
Yeah, it would be over time, right? And I think you can freak people out by saying, this is how I do my life and this is how I do that.
I go to sleep by 10, I wake
Yeah,
up at 6.
yeah. And yeah, just write it on a piece of paper and slide it to them and they have to sign it. I think boundaries are best when things come up.
Oh.
I think a lot of times you can tell people about boundaries, like with me, like I have a special diet. I only eat this. And so it could be very easy to get that across and go to a restaurant. Like, well, this is all the things I'm going to eat. But most boundaries I address once I notice someone isn't behaving in a way I see that makes me uncomfortable or is doing something that I don't agree with. And then sometimes you just set them right away too when it's like in a workspace. When I like onboard a new staff member, I'm going to say, this is how our company works. This is how I work. And so it's a kind of a mix of you do some in the beginning and you do some throughout.
I'm going to ask you a tough question, Justin. How do you set boundaries with your parents or people very close to you?
That can be the hardest one. And I think when you have examples, so if someone set boundaries and you've noticed it over a string of time where you can bring up a couple examples and say, hey, do you got a second to talk, whether that's a phone call. I often recommend sometimes people text message. I know that can seem disingenuous for some. Sometimes it's easier if you're so scared to say it, it might be easier to text it. And that's the kind of world we live in now. It's not considered as disrespectful. But saying, hey, do you got a minute to talk? There's some things I wanted to talk about. And then say, once the conversation starts, like, hey, I just need to get this off my chest and let me finish before you say anything. And it's, hey, I noticed that this time, and this time you did these things and it made me feel this way. And I think when you tell someone about a boundary, more importantly, they need to know what they did wrong or what they did right, whatever it is, and how it made you feel so that they can get a context of maybe stepping in your shoes for a second.
I feel like boundaries could only be set with people that could self-reflect. You know what I mean? Like there's some, and I'll give you an example, like that's not true. Like let's say a mother or father figure, which I love my mom and I love my dad. But I'm just saying, let's say there's a mother or father figure and they can't accept your boundary. They keep doing something and you're like, this is how you're making me feel. And they're like, you're always saying this is my fault. An example of that.
Yeah, back and forth.
Yes. And it's like, there's some people that you can't, tell them to leave your life and exit, but you still want them to be close to you.
Yeah.
How do you set a boundary with a person like that that's like a relative?
So that can be really hard because you can almost set boundaries within boundaries where it's if you address something with someone and they're not hearing you, that's pretty disrespectful. And it's also going to be hard on you, where you can even set a boundary saying, like based on this conversation, maybe we don't hang out for a little while. Maybe we don't talk for a while. You don't make it permanent, like never again, like you did this.
You're out.
We're not, because family is family, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you need some time for healing, but it's setting some sort of boundary around, well, then maybe it's not best that we hang out for a little while. Or maybe it's best that this happens. Or maybe it's best I move out, if you're like arguing with your parents a lot. You sometimes have to set boundaries. And I know people who set boundaries and they haven't talked to family or friends in years just because of the way they got treated.
But I feel like in those cases, it's tough because is there a win-win? You still want them in your life. You want them to change. And then having them kind of exit your life and not speaking to them, that might be hard as well.
It can be. And so I have found
Not to get
sometimes
personal here and deep.
if you're talking with a person that's reasonable, you can always say, it's like, what are your thoughts around this? Because I would like to leave here with having felt like we've accomplished something or gone somewhere with this conversation. And maybe they'll have input. And if they don't, you may just say, we may have to, sideline this or parking lot this conversation for now because it's clear you're not hearing what I have to say.
I kind of like that you said that, like saying what the goal is, the end goal in this conversation. Like, let's say you and I are fighting. I'm like, hey, I want to leave this room being friends,
Yes.
I feel like that kind of sets apart a more of argument versus just being like, no, we're in this together and I want to fix the problem itself.
Yeah, and when you focus on feelings and things like that too, that's another thing I really like about boundaries is you can really paint a picture for someone instead of saying like, you're doing this just pisses me off. It's like, you said these things and it hurt me because of this, or it made me feel this way because of a past life experience I had. And I needed to say something because if I didn't, I'd start to resent you, and so you can sometimes paint a picture and you don't have to address a boundary where sometimes they're very cold and brash, like, do not speak to me like that ever again. Or there's ones where it's like, hey, remember those times you said those things? It brought up this for me, and this is why I'm saying this to you.
Hmm.
There's a softer way always to say things.
And you came on Cato Living, and we just had the show before this podcast, and there's something that Jackson, my co-host, had said. He goes, how do you create boundaries within yourself? And I was like, wow, I never even thought about that.
hadn't
You're
either
so
until he
quick.
said that.
Yeah. I think you're so quick to be like, how do I set boundaries with this person, but how do you set boundaries with yourself?
Yeah. And I honestly think when we talk about self boundaries, that's just another way to put that is goal setting, right? Whether that's writing down what you want to do, making a mental note. There's all sorts of applications and trackers where you can put down your goals or things you don't want to do. And it's something as simple as like if you smoke cigarettes and you wanted to quit and you say, I'm not going to smoke anymore. That's a boundary you're setting in your life. Or like in the recovery world, for me, like a boundary I set, I've been in recovery for 8 years now. I can go into bars and places where drinking and partying is going on, and I can have a good time as long as there's something like music or trivia or there's some sort of event going on. So that's one of my boundaries is I don't just go into bars for the sake of going into bars if people are just going to be drinking. I'll only go in if there's a reason for me to be there. And that's really, really helped because then I'm not purposely putting myself in stressful situations.
Boundaries in personal life, they seem easy, but recovery is a different conversation.
Yeah.
Boundaries within recovery is completely separate and a bit harder, don't you think?
Way harder. And like I learned, when we were talking earlier, is we learn terrible boundaries over years of just dysfunctional behavior because the more you get addicted, the more dysfunctional your life gets. And we learn to treat people bad. We learn to let people treat us any which way. And so it's almost like tenfold when you get into recovery because you have to learn. And usually is learning by people setting them. So that's why I'm never shy at work to set a boundary because when someone crosses it, they may have no idea that they're doing it.
So do you feel like you kind of put yourself first in that situation? I feel like people that don't know how to set boundaries, they're people pleasers. They want to make everyone around them feel better and not themselves. Why do you think that is?
I think it's like we were saying earlier, it's all based on lived experience. It's the way that they've learned that if I treat people a certain way, this is a result I get, and this result makes me feel good or feel bad, whichever way. And so it can be really, really hard for people in the beginning to set those boundaries. And what I've learned is if I set a boundary, if you're doing something, if you did something today and I set a boundary with you, if you are receptive to it, or you may be angry at first, you're going to think about it more because someone said, hey, you did something and it made me feel this way, that you might start to adjust your boundaries. How is someone ever going to know if I don't tell them?
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to paint you a picture here.
Yeah.
Not me, but speaking figuratively, I'm a person who, I don't know, people please, don't know how to set boundaries at work, don't know how to set boundaries with my friends, family, spouse, whatever. And I don't know how to set boundaries within myself. Where do I start? I want to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I want to be better. What do I do?
I have found pen and paper to be a very useful thing in this kind of work. And I always say top 3 or 5 things that are stressing you out because of your boundaries, right? Like, because I'm not doing this, this keeps happening in my life. Or these people are treating me this way, and I'm so sick of people not saying that. I can think of an example when I used to have an old job in the construction trades, and all people did was call me names and tease me all day because that's kind of how construction line of work works sometimes. And until I stood up for myself, nothing ever changed. Until I said, stop talking to me that way, right? And I kept coming to work more and more anxious, more and more angry. And so writing down some of those top 3 things and then picking 1 or 2 that are the easiest to start with. And then I honestly think writing it down. How am I going to handle this? What am I going to say to this person? How am I going to make sure I get all my points heard? Because often when it's pent up and we get emotional, it just comes out like blah, and we want it to make sense. We want it to sound like we're of sound mind, that we're not losing or coming from a place of emotion.
I'm the type of person, like, I'll let things slide and then it builds up. And I've always thought that was the way. You got to be quiet about it, keep it inside, maintain a healthy, because you could erupt very quickly.
Yeah.
And then I'm learning that this is not the best way because how can somebody know they've upset you if you've never told them?
Yeah, and I'm like a firm believer of don't sweat the small stuff. So if someone says something to me, does something that's upsetting, crosses a little boundary, I often let it slide. Then if I notice they do it a second time, a third time, I'm like, all right, this person clearly doesn't know that this is my boundary, or they have no idea about boundaries. So sometimes it's like I'll even say that to them when I address a boundary. I'm like, do you even realize that you're saying this or doing this or making this same comment over and over, and that can be bothersome to me and to other people?
I was watching a podcast, and this is kind of, it was really interesting. Basically, the lady who was in the podcast was saying, sometimes when people want to like hurt you or poke you a little bit, they'll say a joke, right? And they'll all laugh and whatnot. And if you ask them, hey, can you please repeat the joke you said? They won't want to hurt you again, and they'll be like, oh wait, that was actually kind of mean, and they definitely would not repeat it twice. And I thought that was kind of interesting. Like you could just ask, like, hey, can you repeat that? And people tend to kind of stray away.
Yes, they can. And it's oftentimes when people cross boundaries or know they're doing it on purpose, it's really subtle and it just increases over time. It's almost kind of even some things kind of like when people get gaslit or go through traumatic things, and people just slowly do it more and more. And we do live in the state of passive aggressive, Minnesota passive aggressive. And so you get that a lot in Minnesota too, where someone will say, it's fine, and then they'll make some snide comment after that, making you know that it's not okay, and then they just laugh about it and walk away. And so if people continue to do stuff like that with me too, it's like clearly something has upset you. I think we should sit down and talk about it so that you don't keep like, I don't appreciate when people make comments like that.
But I think that takes a lot of emotional maturity, and
It does,
I feel
and
like
we live in a world where there's not a lot of that.
that's the thing is how can you set a boundary if people around you aren't really even open to it?
So you can say something. It doesn't mean that someone's going to be receptive to it. And if they're going to continue that, like we were talking about before, if they're going to continue that behavior, that's just someone you shouldn't have in your life. And that means if you work with them, you may just have to find ways to avoid them or only talk to them when you have to. And if you live with them or you're close to them, it's setting those boundaries of like, I'm just not going to talk to you until you kind of see things a different way.
How did you feel when you said you worked in the construction trade and you went and you told them, hey, these jokes don't slide? How did they react? Was it uncomfortable for a
It was
while?
super uncomfortable, and they kind of laughed it off, and it didn't change. And so shortly after that, I left. Like I didn't want to put up with it anymore. I did the same work. I just went to a different place, and it felt very, very good to say though, because I had been waiting months to say it. Showing up to work depressed for months because of the way people treated you, and all I had to say was something. And, actually a couple people even in that conversation came to my defense, and, I thought I was all alone. And that's another part of boundaries is oftentimes people will come alongside you. I'd say 75% of the time when you set boundaries, if you do it in the right way, it doesn't go south. Like the person doesn't yell at you, the relationship doesn't end, and that people will respect you for doing it.
Did you feel a weight off your shoulders when you said something?
Yes, absolutely. Just a huge weight. It just felt like that knot that gets tied up in your chest went away. And it's like, it's comparable to, because I would even say sometimes setting a boundary is like going through a breakup. If you've ever had to dump someone, or the first couple times you've ever had to go through a breakup, how hard that was. And usually breakups happen because you have some sort of boundaries that have been crossed. You don't like this person anymore, or something's happened where they crossed the line and you're not okay with it. And it can be so hard to say it. And then once you get through it, it's not nearly as bad as you thought.
When you had told them, hey, I don't like the jokes that you guys are saying, and they kind of brushed it off, going in to work the next couple of days, how did you feel? Were you more anxious that you said something, or did you feel more relieved?
I felt more relieved, and I found myself able to stand up to them more. I wouldn't say like standing up's the greatest word either, but being able to say stuff back when they said it. Like, hey, you need to stop talking to me like that. Where before, it took months to say one thing, and then once you've said it, it's out there, and you're able to say it again and again.
Do you feel life has been going better for you since you started setting boundaries?
My life has gotten astronomically better. My relationships with my family, with my friends, how I handle coworkers and staff members, it's improved a lot. and I have less embarrassing moments, right?
I have a lot of those.
Yeah, right? And you need those. That's the thing, though. I don't think I would have changed unless I had bad boundaries and someone like my boss or other people that cared about me said stuff. Because if
Hmm.
no one says anything, you can't change or you're not even aware of it.
Hmm.
And it makes you think that that behavior is okay until it happens or until you do something to change it.
So what's that coworker that you had mentioned that kind of went into the office to the boss and said, "Hey,
Mhm.
he did this." Did you ever go and apologize? Because people don't really talk about apologies after crossing a boundary.
No, not with that individual in particular, because oftentimes in the workplace, the reason they go to your boss is because they don't want any drama with it or it to be weird. I have, though, gone to other people and other situations that have happened where I've gone and apologized, and it was healing on both sides, I think. Like, I didn't even realize it happened, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that if you're willing.
Mhm.
You know, we talk about setting boundaries for others, but what if we crossed a boundary? What if we're the ones that did something bad? How do we go about that?
Well, first, someone's going to let you know they crossed it, unless you know you did something that crossed it and the person's acting really angry and you've got reasons to. And when someone has reasons to, I always come up and it's like, hey, you got a second to chat. And it's like, remember whatever happened yesterday and I said those things. That's not what I meant. That's not how I want to show up. I really want to find a way to make it up. How does that look for you?
Hmm.
Because I often try to avoid saying the words, I'm sorry. I only say it if I absolutely have to. And if I'm genuinely sorry, I feel it's a filler word. Like when people say but,
Oh, I say I'm sorry
and,
all the time.
and sorry. It's just some reaction that
Yeah.
people have. And so when I really do apologize or I really want to own up to something, I want to say more than I'm just sorry. I want to explain, like, I noticed I did this and it was doing this to you. And that's not how I want to show up. Like, what can I do to make it better? I'll be more aware of it next time so that if it happens, I can catch it. I often feel when you come with an apology, you should be offering some sort of solution as well.
Interesting.
Mhm.
I feel like when people know they did something bad, the reason apology isn't given is because, there's one, it could be pride,
Mhm.
being scared is another. I feel like fear is a big play in apologizing. What is your advice or tips to someone that wants to apologize but doesn't really know how to go about it?
I think a biggest part, and this was hard for me because I am one of the most stubborn people I know,
Me too.
right? Yeah. Is knowing that you're human and that you're going to make mistakes and that if you care about someone, this is how you show up in relationships. So setting boundaries in any area of your life is absolutely healthy. It's one of the most healthy things you can do. And even if people set boundaries with you, because that's how you get on the same page.
Mm.
How are you ever supposed to know that someone's making you feel a certain way unless they say something or there's something comes out of it? And so I think the biggest part when it's scary is just pushing yourself beyond that fear.
Mm.
And the hardest part for most people is doing it. And then, like I said, once you've learned to do it in one area of your life, it makes it easier in the others.
Nice.
And I wish there was a better answer than just do it. Because what will happen if you don't is that relationship will worsen, whatever it looks like. And people will get resentful towards you. And they'll think you don't care or that you don't love them or that you don't appreciate their work ethic or whatever it may be.
Mm. I know you said that people don't want to hear it, but it might be as simple as just doing it. That's the answer.
It is. And sometimes it's just scary. And I just the first couple times you do it, it's going to come out weird. You may blurt it all out at once really fast. And then you get a little more calm and collected after the first few times. And I found too, when you first start setting boundaries, it may be blurted out. And then even as you're explaining yourself, now that you got the first chunk out, you start to slow down and get more calm.
I feel like mine, I'd probably not speak English. I notice when I get nervous, I ramble and you cannot hear what I'm saying.
Yeah,
So
ramble.
like the
I get
first
sweaty
time.
or red in the face.
Huh.
And that can be hard too, because if I get embarrassed, my face turns bright red. And so I've had that happen while, apologizing or setting boundaries.
Hmm.
And I have found sometimes if it really bothered you, even waiting for it to become from a less emotional space. So let's say I had a participant do something and it wasn't like a major boundary violation where I needed to address it right there. I may wait and think about it. And then the next time we meet, say, hey, the last time we talked, I wanted to talk to you about something quick. You said this, this, and this, and that's inappropriate because. And so silence or taking your time to respond to someone when a boundary's been crossed is perfectly okay. I mean, it's good to try to address them immediately. If you can't do that, find a way to think about it and write it out and then address it the next time you see them.
That's interesting you say that. Something I've been learning to do is when I get upset, I will say things I don't mean. That's
Yes.
a very common thing for me. And then I'll like regret it instantly. Be like, oh my gosh, I didn't mean that. I said it out of anger or resentment or whatever it is. So I've been trying to take some space and get quiet and then get all the angry thoughts out of my head and then come back to it. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. And so with work, I'm a little quicker with setting boundaries because work's a little different. There's people right there. I can usually put my emotion sides. In my personal life, I've learned that I need a minute. I need to sit, like whether it's taking 10 breaths, an hour, sometimes a day or two, till I respond back to that person in whichever way I seem fit. And I found it's because anytime you come from a point of emotion, whether you're happy, sad, whatever it is, your answer is going to differ from a spot where you're just calm and collected. And you're not the only one. I have said some very hurtful things in the heat of the moment just
Yeah.
because I was upset. And so I always try to remember, like before I send that text message back when someone says something that
caps.
upsets me, yeah, I think, should I be saying this right now? And sometimes I'll just leave the message there and I'll wait 10 minutes. And if I read it 10 minutes later, I'm like, delete.
See, that's an interesting thing to admit. I feel like a lot of people don't want to admit that, but you can say a lot of things when you're upset and angry. So
Yes, you can say a lot of different things, and it's just being hot-headed, and we all are guilty of it. It's you're not the only one that does it,
Yeah.
And that's what I think you got to remind yourself too. Is you make a mistake setting a boundary, you apologize, you say thank you, you do any of these little tips that we have that you're not supposed to do. You just understand you're learning. It's like it's just like anything. It takes practice.
it's a good way.
So it's like I can talk about this so easily and give you all these go-to phrases and statements and things to say because I've just practiced. And then I've taught people how to do it amongst themselves.
What is a piece of advice you would tell yourself when you were younger?
To hold on to hope that it does get better. Because I know I spent most of my middle school years and high school years thinking everything was hopeless. And it took me until 30 years old to figure out what I was going to be doing with my life. And that it's never too late to figure that out. And that you just got to hold on sometimes and you're going to find your way.
Wow. That was beautifully said. Why do you think it took you in your 30s to discover that?
I think I had a lot of knocking around to do with what we call life. I had a lot of tough lessons to learn, and I talk about that. There's so many hard things that have happened in my life, and I would never take any of them back because they've got me to where I needed to be. And I think I finally just had to get to a place where I needed to realize that the people and the places and the things that where I was surrounding myself with weren't okay anymore, and I had to go through all that to realize that I had to change. And that happens for people at many different points. Some people, when they're adolescent. Sometimes it's in their 20s. Sometimes I've worked with people who don't figure it out till they're in their 60s. It's just never too late. And they all just get to a point where they get fed up with the way they've been treating themselves and the way they've been treating other people. And so it all ties back to boundaries.
And I was going to say, I feel like if you hadn't learned those tough lessons, then you wouldn't even be talking about setting boundaries today,
No, I wouldn't be doing any of the things I did. I wouldn't be running a nonprofit that helps people that did similar things to me. I wouldn't be owning my own home, driving my own car, having quality friendships, a solid relationship with my family, and then being able to even train people. That's a lot of what I do too, is train people on a whole host of topics and looked at as a guide and mentor in the community. None of that would have happened had I not changed.
Well, thank you, Justin, for being so open, vulnerable, and willing to share your story. I know it's going to help a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming on.
Mm-hmm.